Would you still believe in God if he spoke to you through fever, famine, and fear? Joan does not wake so much as reboot. One instant she is a shard of dream, fire speaking Latin, saints bickering like tired parents, and the next she is back inside her own ribs, lungs rattling in the pre-dawn chill. The hay beneath her is damp with sweat, mouse droppings, maybe blood, hers, maybe yesterday's. The hut smells of wet wool and wood smoke, of arm fatigue and distrust. A rooster out in the mist tries to crow, but gags halfway, as though even the birds of Lorraine can't clear their throats this season. 17, she reminds herself, because numbers anchor things. 17 summers alive, 12 teeth that no longer ache, 3 saints who will not shut up, 1 country on life support. She sits. The wool shift clings to her skin, glossy with the kind of fever sweat that feels personal, almost accusatory. Under the shift, her breasts ache, partly from the binding, partly from the fact that she still owns them. Chest wrapped first, she takes the linen strip, ties it tight, knots it flatter than yesterday. Hide the softness, keep the command. That is not scripture, but it should be. Outside, men cough as though they owe lungs to a tax collector. Metal clanks. Somebody curses the English. Someone else curses the French. Someone curses God under his breath, which feels brave until you remember where you are. The door creaks. Etienne peers in, barely 15, eyes too old, holding her breastplate. He avoids her gaze, offers metal the way altar boys offer wine. Yesterday he called her petite sœur. Today he calls her Madame. Grief and awe have different accents. The plate is cold, streaked with mud, dented where a rider's mace caught her 2 days ago. She slides it on and the chill sizzles against her fever. Etienne fastens the straps with hands that shake more than hers. When he is done, he makes a clumsy sign of the cross, as if the armor is holy, or she is. A gust slips through the thatch. Joan tastes rain and distant smoke. The siege fires at Orléans never quite go out. They just trade shifts with the wind. Somewhere in that orange haze are men who want her captured, theologians who want her unmasked, and bishops who want her politely dead. They will get 2 out of 3. She stands. The new boots still pinch the arches of her feet. Gift from the Dauphin, whose idea of generosity is leather stiff as penance. She slides the sword belt on. The blade is not Excalibur, only decent iron hammered by a blacksmith who smelled like onions, but soldiers fall silent when she draws it. Image is everything when your resume says, "Peasant girl claims to hear heaven." Etienne hands her the banner last. White silk, lilies, the name Jesus sewn so large it could blind a skeptic. It is lighter than the sword, heavier than any sin she knows. Saints Catherine and Margaret said, "Carry the banner, let the men carry the steel." She did, and the men followed, and now nobody knows whether the miracle is hers or theirs. She steps into the yard. Mud yawns around her boots. A company of soldiers, faces cracked by frost and disappointment, stand to attention. They whisper prayers, spit, scratch, cross themselves, scratch again. One giant of a man, scars like map lines, drops to his knee. He is missing 3 fingers. He salutes with 2. "If they kneel to you, kneel to God harder," the voices say. She does not answer aloud. Talking back to clouds is one thing, letting the army see it is another. The morning is gray, but candles flicker at the edge of her sight. They are not candles, just her fever firing sparks at the corners of vision. She blinks them away. Focus. Orléans lies downriver, choked by English fortifications, its people as worn as their walls. Her task is ridiculous. Convince war-torn veterans that salvation wears braids and chafes under armor. The chaplain arrives with a travel chalice and breath that smells of onions and doubt. He recites half a psalm, forgets the rest, and settles for patting her armored shoulder. God chooses the weak to shame the strong, he mutters, unsure if that comforts or condemns. Joan answers with the smallest, sharpest nod in Lorraine. Mounting the horse is the real penance. The saddle horn bruises yesterday's bruises, and the mail chausses bite at her thighs. The mare snorts. She too wonders what business a girl has in plate and prophecy. Joan leans forward, whispers, "We walk through fire, little sister. Don't shy." The horse, being a horse, only flicks an ear. Still, Joan imagines agreement. She raises the banner. Silk cracks in the wind like a fresh wound. Somewhere behind her, a veteran murmurs, "If she falls, France falls." A second voice hisses, "If she wins, God help us all." They ride regardless. Joan tastes copper, maybe from the bitten inside of her cheek, maybe from the invisible crown of martyrdom tightening ahead of schedule. She recalls bread. Yesterday's loaf was stale enough to hammer nails, but she ate it anyway. Hunger is a currency. She spends it daily. Wind picks up. Rain arrives in needles. Her fever flares and cools at once. She closes her eyes only long enough to hear the saints again, 3 tongues weaving one command: forward. So she goes. And every hoofbeat, mud, splash, argues with the skeptics, the theologians, the unkind arithmetic of war. Every breath in iron is a wager that God still gambles on France. Half a league ahead, the English banners lurk like bruises against the sky. Joan adjusts her grip, feels the raw sting where the banner pole rubs her palm. The pain is sharp, real, hers. She clings to it the way drowning men cling to driftwood. If God is speaking through fever, famine, and fear, then fever becomes scripture, famine becomes fast, fear becomes fuel. Joan of Arc rides, and the world, reluctantly, violently, reshapes itself around the impossible fact of her. The day has not even started, and already history is limping to catch up. They see her long before she sees them. A dusty cluster of veterans waits at the tree line, mail rusting at the seams, eyes like knife points under their sallets. They expected a messenger from the Dauphin, some ragged squire with parchment and excuses. Instead, out of the fog comes a girl on a church-white horse, banner blazing with lilies, fever-bright gaze fixed on the horizon. The murmurs start soft, rat-scratch quiet. Too small, too clean, too alive. A crossbowman spits. A pikeman laughs the way men laugh at pawn-shop miracles. Yet none step forward to block her path. They hold formation the way gamblers hold their breath as the dice rattle, half hoping for sorcery, half certain someone is cheating. Joan reins in. Mud splashes the greaves of the front rank. She counts scars, missing ears, fingers turned black by old frostbite. France has been at war so long its soldiers are museums of injury. She notes, too, the way they clutch weapons like arguments they refuse to lose. No herald announces her. No trumpet dares. She speaks herself, voice steady as church bells. "Good morning, my brothers. Did you sleep?" It is not a question. It is an accusation. Everyone here knows sleep is treason when Orléans starves. Their captain pushes through. La Hire, wolf-shouldered, breath of wine and onions. He could snap her spine with one arm, but his eyes slide off hers, as if staring too long might brand him heretic. "The Dauphin sends us a child?" he growls. "A child," Joan agrees, "who came to fetch grown men." She says it gently, almost pitying, as though their beards and blood are charms that failed them. Before he can answer, she swings down from the saddle. The breastplate clanks. The army flinches. Sound travels differently around legends in progress. La Hire thrusts a dagger into the mud between them. Prove God favors you. Pull it out. Joan looks at the blade as if at a sleeping snake. Then she kneels, not to the captain, but to the earth itself. Fingers brush the hilt, lips move. Saint Michael, give strength enough. She draws. The dagger slides free, clean as truth. Mud hisses. A shiver runs the ranks. Grown killers feeling for one heartbeat, like choir boys at First Communion. But faith is fickle. A grizzled archer snorts, "Even my daughter could do that." Joan turns to him. "Your daughter fights. She milks goats. Then teach her the bow. We need every hand." The archer opens his mouth, closes it. Somewhere inside, an assumption crumbles. La Hire tests again. "Know you the password for tonight's watch?" "I know that you changed it thrice after losing 2 scouts yesterday," she says, reciting each discarded word, lune, justice, espérance, before naming the fresh one, miséricorde. Gasps. Only the inner circle knew. She smiles, not smug, only sad. Heaven hears what men whisper to the dark. Armor scrapes, heads bow. Slowly, like icicles thawing, knees bend. One by one the killers kneel before the child they had planned to mock. She feels their submission settle on her shoulders, heavier than any steel. Yet obedience is not acceptance. Fear masquerades as faith all the time. She must make them believe. "Stand," she orders. They rise. "Your swords weigh more than you remember. Your bellies are ghosts. Your prayers taste like rust. Still you breathe. That means God has wagered on you again." She paces, banner catching the first shred of morning sun. "I will ride first into every breach. If I fall, flee. If I advance, advance faster. If I pray, echo me. We will take the Loire forts like knives through rotten bread, because France is not dying. She is simply choking, and we are the hand on her back." La Hire's jaw works. Finally he nods, just once, but it feels like a treaty signed in bone. "Mount up," he barks. Orders ripple out, cuirasses clang, horses snort clouds of steam. In 10 minutes the camp looks less like an orphanage of violence and more like an army again. Joan watches them form column. She ignores the tremor in her knees, the blister under her left heel, the voice of St. Catherine cautioning her to rest. Rest is for when angels have vacancies. Today they are overbooked. Etienne appears with her helmet. Inside, a scrap of parchment bears a hastily inked prayer. He slips it beneath the padding like a mother tucking a lullaby. She thanks him with her eyes. Language would dilute the moment. Before she mounts, Joan raises the banner so high the silk snaps. "Remember this hour," she calls, "when the enemy asks why you obeyed a girl." "What shall we answer?" someone shouts. "That we obeyed no girl," she replies. "We obeyed France finally remembering herself." A roar rises, part hymn, part animal. It shakes leaves from trees, doubt from ribs, cynicism from crumbling faith. Even La Hire grins, wolfish still, but now his fangs guard rather than threaten. They ride. Mud becomes melody under hoof. The sky burns off its dawn fog, revealing the distant English bastions like rotten teeth in a swollen gum. Joan grips the banner, feels the pole bite her blister anew. Good. Pain is proof of living, and living is prerequisite for victory. Behind her thunder 200 men accustomed to following gold, fear, or habit. Today they chase impossibility. Tomorrow, God willing, or stubbornness willing, they will drive it straight through the walls of Orléans. As the column dips out of the clearing, a single voice carries forward. She's not a child, she's a verdict. No one disagrees. Night falls like a hood over the camp. Fires wink through the murk, low and sullen, because too much flame invites English arrow fletching. Pots of barley stew burble. Men chew in silence that isn't quite prayer and isn't quite resignation. Armor creaks, bowstrings twang in idle tuning, and somewhere a card game dies when one player accuses another of cheating with miracles. Joan sits apart on an overturned bucket, banner furled beside her like a sleeping serpent. She unstraps her gauntlets. Her palms are raw moons, split where the pole rubbed all day. Etienne wants to fetch salve. She waves him off. Pain, she insists, is a psalm the body sings to keep the soul attentive. But tonight, it's not the body that aches loudest. The first whisper arrives just after the moon clears the clouds. A syllable without shape, skating the inside of her skull. Then another, overlapping, folding, braiding. Soon, 3 distinct timbres ripple through her like wind through cathedral pipes. Catherine first, steady, merciful, a nurse changing bandages in a battlefield of doubt. Then Margaret, brisk, stern, the older sister who loves you enough to scold you into glory. Last, Michael, brass and thunder, a war drum masquerading as a voice. They do not sound like dreams. Dreams are sloppy, melting things. These saints arrive with punctuation. Joan presses her thumb to the notch above her breastbone and answers under her breath. "I'm listening." A sentry glances over, curious. She smiles at him, harmless as a girl greeting moths. He relaxes. She returns to the conversation no one else can hear. "Courage tomorrow," Catherine murmurs, "but rest tonight." The devil sharpens his questions. "Sharpen your answers," Margaret adds. "Count the doubts of men the way you count arrows, then return them. Point first," Michael concludes. She absorbs each word. They arrive like dew and weigh like anvils. Yet tonight, between their counsels, another sound bleeds through, voices of flesh and bone, echoing inside memory. She hears the tavern gossip from Domremy, old men calling her odd calf, women crossing themselves when she passed. She hears the priests who grilled her about virginity as if purity were gunpowder that might misfire. She hears the Dauphin's advisors wagering bottles of wine on how quickly the girl will embarrass them. Those human voices scare her more than the celestial ones. Heaven demands obedience, men demand explanation, and explanations can be dismantled until nothing holy remains. She closes her eyes and tries to map the difference between revelation and hallucination. A physician in Orléans once told a story of soldiers driven mad by ergot bread, seeing demons in every candle flame. What if her angels are just clever mold hitchhiking on rye? "Faith is not a fever," Catherine whispers, detecting the tremor in her doubt. "But a fever can be faith's furnace," Margaret counters. Michael says nothing this time, only lets his silence hum like a drawn sword. Joan exhales. "Whether you are spores or seraphim, the mission stands," she tells the dark. "So speak, or leave me with my own heartbeat." The saints oblige. They show her a picture sharper than dream. Orléans' southern wall at dawn, mist hugging the Loire, English banners drooping with dew. They highlight weak palisades, trace unseen supply lines, sketch the cracks in enemy confidence like tutors pointing at letters on a parchment. "Left bank assault," she murmurs, memorizing angles. 2 bridges, 1 decoy. Fire arrows first, but save the ladders for after the smoke. Spare the baker's district. Bread is not the enemy. A hunk of wood snaps in the fire. 2 soldiers glance over. She pretends to be checking her sword blade for nicks. Inside, the saints change tone. Personal now, intimate as confession. "Your armor is whole, but your faith has dents," Catherine notes. "Hammer it flat before dawn," Margaret says. Michael finally speaks. "And remember, every prophecy is a contract. Fulfill it or forfeit the wages of heaven." She swallows. Contracts imply penance if broken. She thinks of flame, rope, accusations of witchcraft. She thinks of her mother's face the night Joan left home, pride braided painfully with terror. A wind flaps the banner, lilies flash white in the gloom. Joan asks the question she saves for nights no one else is awake. If I am wrong, will you forgive me for being certain? Silence. Even saints hesitate at theology that raw. But then, soft, almost maternal, Catherine answers, "Better to be bold in love than safe in skepticism." Joan's shoulders loosen just slightly. Doubt remains, but it is corralled, harnessed, made useful like a stubborn mule forced to pull a plow. She stands to walk the perimeter. The camp is a quilt of exhaustion. Men drooling on helm rims, boys muttering nightmares, veterans fingering rosaries until beads grind into powder. She touches shoulders, straightens a dangling blanket, tucks a spare log under a sleeping man's feet so frost won't gnaw his bones. None wake. Perhaps her presence has become sedative, a lullaby hummed in steel. At the far edge, Etienne guards the horses. He startles when she appears, but tries to hide it. She smiles, steals half a crust from his ration bag, and eats it gritty with ash. Hunger is democratic. "Do you hear them now, madame?" he asks, gaze flicking skyward. "All the time," she admits, voice low. But tonight they sounded tired. Even saints need rest, especially saints. She presses the crust into his hand. So do pages, sleep. He obeys, curling beside a mare's warm flank. Joan strokes the animal's mane and wonders if horses dream of grass even when war paints the world the color of iron. Back at her bucket throne, she takes out a stub of charcoal and sketches in the dirt the plan the voices gave her: arrows, ladders, bridges, bakeries spared. Then with her thumb she smears the lines away. Secrets should travel light. The moon sets. The saints withdraw, or perhaps her fever cools for a spell. Either way, the hush that follows is ocean-sized. Joan inhales it like someone tasting fresh bread after months of crusts. She whispers to the empty air, "If tomorrow I fall, let the plan stand." No answer, yet the silence doesn't sting. It folds around her, blanket soft. She allows herself, miracle of miracles, a yawn. For 5 heartbeats, she debates, lying down. Then she remembers every story where generals died in their sleep because comfort dulled their vigilance. Instead, she props the banner against her shoulder, closes one eye, keeps the other on the glowing coals. When dawn pries apart the horizon, it finds Joan of Arc half dozing, half watching, wholly listening for voices that may be heaven, may be fever, but are undeniably hers to bear. And if the scariest voice tomorrow belongs not to angels but to doubt, she will answer it the same way she answers muskets and malice, with forward motion. Dawn arrives the medieval way, a fist of cold air punching through the tents, the smell of boiled horse oats, and somebody's unwashed feet daring to compete with the smoke. Joan is already awake. Was she ever truly asleep? Buckling gauntlets over hands that still pulse from yesterday's grip. Every joint clicks like a worn rosary. 17 really shouldn't sound this old. She shifts and feels it. A tug low in her belly, liquid heat blooming where iron meets flesh. Perfect timing, she thinks. Uterus versus England. Place your bets. Binding comes first. The linen strip she uses to press her chest flat must now serve double duty, absorbing what the church politely calls flux. She folds fresh cloth, tucks it beneath her chausses, and cinches it tight so no red betrays itself on silver plate. Let one stain escape, and the whispers begin. Unclean, Eve's curse, omen. Joan breathes through the first cramp. A midwife had once likened pain to a stubborn goat. Talk firm, don't panic. Goats, she decides, were easier than kingdoms. Etienne appears with the cuirass before she can flinch. The metal is both sanctuary and predator, shielding lungs, yet pinching ribs greedy for air. Today she will race up siege ladders, steel will rub raw under her arms, and mail will saw at her hips. The saints never mentioned chafe. A wave of nausea hits as the buckles slam home. She steadies herself on Etienne's skinny shoulder. "Fine," she lies. "Soldiers lie all the time. That's why they pray so hard." At the mess kettles, porridge slumps into bowls the color of defeat. Joan forces down 3 spoonfuls. Hunger retreats. Cramps advance. She chews willow bark shavings the chaplain finally relinquishes after she quotes scripture about God inventing medicine. Bitterness numbs her tongue, maybe her womb. Armor clanks into rank. Joan rides at the front, banner high. Each bounce of the saddle rattles her organs. She clamps her thighs, wills muscles to behave. Blood warms the linen. She can feel saturation but won't check. Lahir eyes her. "You're pale, maid." Pale is the color of prophecy. She fires back, and the column chuckles. Humor is lighter than chainmail. They reach the Loire's edge. English arrows whistle overhead like lazy hornets. Joan swings from the saddle. Impact shocks her abdomen, sends iron taste flooding her mouth. Ladders slam against stone. She climbs. Splinters bite her palms, cramps bite harder. Halfway up she pauses, not from fear but to nudge the linen higher before it migrates. One slip, and blood could slick her footing. A boy behind her shouts, "Move, my lady!" She answers by climbing faster, pain flashing bright, then cooling like quenched iron. She's first over the parapet, banner, then sword. An English helmet meets wood. Banner poles make excellent hammers. She calls the men up, and they pour over the wall. Amid the chaos, her free hand presses below the breastplate, steadying more than just the banner. The fort falls before noon. Victory smells like burnt pork and terror. Cramps ease. Battle's bizarre mercy. Etienne brings water. She drinks, then asks for spare linen. Behind a shattered merlin he stands guard while she changes. Evidence of humanity is liability. Saints aren't supposed to bleed. She knots the stained cloth, tucks it into a pouch, and steps back into legend. Someone tries to hoist her on their shoulders. Too risky. Up close they might see fatigue puddling around her eyes. Lahir grins through soot. "We thought the English ruthless. Turns out your courage is crueler." "Courage," she answers, "is just pain that learned manners." They march back under a sky bruised purple, campfires already stuttering alive. Joan strips the cuirass at the flames, ribs blooming pink where metal kissed too hard. Belly muscles twitch, sore and spent. She sips thin wine while the saints murmur faint approval. Courage fulfilled, body endured, always forward. She presses a warm stone to her stomach. Outside the tent, soldiers compare scars, ignorant that the most miraculous wound in camp was invisible and monthly and never slowed the charge. In the hush before sleep, Joan thanks her own flesh for burning and still bearing her onward, for being battlefield and weapon in the same brave breath. 3 weeks before Orléans sang her name, Joan of Arc nearly lost her head to her own side. The story remains a footnote in monkish margins, but in the hall at Chinon, it felt like destiny hanging by a frayed hemp thread. She had ridden 100 miles through mud season to reach the Dauphin, her banner crusted with road dust, her body aching like a bell after mass. Word spread faster than hooves. A peasant girl who claims angels, wants armies, refuses dresses. By the time she crossed the castle drawbridge, half the court already had verdicts tucked behind their tongues. The first ambush was silence. Noblemen aligned along the corridor like gargoyles, stone-faced, unmoving, eyes flicking from her calloused hands to her weather-cracked cheeks. They smelled of lavender water and distrust. Joan smelled of horse and miracles, two scents equally offensive to politicians. A page guided her into a candlelit chamber. 60 theologians waited, robes shimmering like oil spilled on water. At their center sat Jean de la Roche, Archbishop of Reims, in everything but humility. His ring was a citadel of gold. Kissing it felt like nursing iron. They offered neither chair nor water. Interrogation masquerades best as hospitality withheld. "Name," the Archbishop began. "Jeanne d'Arc." "Claim?" "That God commands me to raise the siege of Orleans and crown the Dauphin in Reims." Ink quills scratched. The confidence of her tone offended some invisible order. The youngest scribe coughed, as if prophecy were dust. A theologian leaned forward. "You call yourself La Pucelle, the maid. How prove you this purity?" Joan blinked, more bored than shocked. "Ask the women who slept beside me on the road. Ask the soldiers who would sooner kiss steel than spare blushes." Murmurs. A parchment creaked under the sudden weight of hastily revised notes. Another stood, spectacles catching torchlight. "Voices, you say. Describe them." "Warm as June, stern as Lent, bright as Easter." "Blasphemy by metaphor," the Archbishop murmured. He motioned. A guard placed a Bible on the table. "Swear upon Holy Scripture that you are not moved by fiends," the clerk intoned. She laid both palms on the calfskin cover. Her hands shook, not fear but fatigue, but the room inhaled as one, mistaking tremor for guilt. "I swear," she said, voice low but clear, "by the God who fashions saints from stutterers and kings from bastards." A savage choice of words. Some priests paled, having forgotten the Dauphin's questionable legitimacy. The Archbishop's eyes narrowed. He turned pages of a legal codex, as though looking for a rope inside a book. "The punishment for false prophecy is burning," he reminded. "Then keep your fire handy," Joan answered, "and we will see whom it serves first." Gasps echoed. One elderly canon pressed knuckles to lips to hide a grin. They questioned her 12 hours. Visions, seasons, prayers, herding tricks, the shape of angels' wings, her opinion on clerical tithes. Each answer she gave sharpened their dilemma: execute her and risk silencing heaven, or release her and risk endorsing heresy. Evening fell. Candles guttered, wax puddled like melted verdicts. The youngest monk fainted from fatigue. Joan remained upright. Though her knees buzzed, her bladder screamed, and her stomach gnawed prayers into itself. At last, the Archbishop closed his tome. "One test remains," he said. "We shall examine you, body and soul." Body first. 2 matrons of noble birth led her to a side chamber. They stripped her to chemise, searched for witch marks, extra nipples, devil's bites, sigils cut by moonlight. They found freckles, bruises, a scar on her knee shaped like Normandy, but no proof of pact or poison. They looked in her eyes, perhaps expecting goat pupils, only brown, ringed with exhaustion. Soul next. Confession under seal. A Dominican friar knelt opposite her in the chapel porch. She listed sins: impatience, vanity, once stealing her father's best cloak to sneak to Mass. No lust, no pact, no blood oath. She wept at the memory of cursing a mule. The friar wept too, perhaps jealous of such minor trespasses. When she returned, the theologians whispered among themselves. Someone produced gallows votes on scraps of vellum: heretic, visionary, pawn, threat. The Archbishop tallied and scowled. The count was tied. Enter politics. Georges de la Trémoille, the Dauphin's chief minister, slipped into the hall. He bowed almost mockingly to the Archbishop, then addressed the assembly. "Burn her tonight, and you confirm English propaganda that France is guided by devils. Test her on the field instead. If God favors her, he will prove it with victories we desperately need. If he does not, the English will provide the pyre, sparing us the wood." Silence rippled. The logic was cruel, economical, irrefutable. Even the archbishop tasted its bitter sense. A vote retaken shifted by 3 hands. Verdict: proceed to military trial by ordeal. The polite phrasing of "let the arrows decide." They dismissed her near midnight. Joan exited into a corridor washed blue by moonlight. Etienne waited with her sword. His face was sewage pale. "Well?" he asked. "They wish to see if angels bleed," she said, sliding blade to scabbard. "Tomorrow we ride." In her cell-sized guest room she knelt to pray, not for salvation, but for a mule she once cursed and a country she refused to. Dawn crept like guilt over the windowsill. She rose, strapped on the cuirass the church had tried to condemn, and walked out to earn her stay of execution one victory at a time. History would later polish the scene into divine endorsement, but truth kept the scorch marks. France very nearly burned its savior before the English ever got the chance. Only bureaucracy, battlefield math, and Joan's own stubborn pulse shoved her from stake to saddle. And somewhere in the rafters of Chinon that night, a spider spun its web between candle stubs, proof that fragile things survive inquisitions too. The English garrison at Tourelle liked to imagine themselves tiger brave. They drank their ale from dented helmets, boasted that French blood made fine shoe polish, and reinforced every rumor that the Maid was a sorceress with the bravado of men who secretly hope monsters stay mythical. At dawn, fog sagged over the Loire like a quilt left out overnight. On the French bank, Joan mounted her mare, white save for a mud splatter shaped uncannily like a fleur-de-lis. She carried no lance today, only the banner. La Hire asked if she wanted a spear. She said banners stab deeper. A trumpet barked. French infantry advanced, shields thumping in nervous rhythm. The English responded with jeers that steamed in the cold air, coward frogs, butter breaths, gutless priests' pets. Steel clanged against ramparts in a percussive threat display. Standard Tuesday. Then the fog thinned, and the English saw her, a lone figure on horseback, silk flag unfurling like dawn itself, armor gleaming despite yesterday's grime. To them, she looked 6 feet tall at least, though Joan barely crested 5. Perspective is a drunken mathematician. Someone on the wall muttered, "That's the witch girl." Another answered, "Witch? She's a shadow the French conjured to hide their defeats." A third whispered the worst possibility. What if shadow is enough? Joan was still 100 yards out when arrows began to fall, not volleys, but frantic individual shots. A commander shouted to hold fire. Archers ignored him. Fear outranked sergeants. Shafts hissed overhead, buried themselves in wet earth. Joan didn't flinch. She merely raised the banner higher, let its lily-white belly catch the weak sun. English morale slipped a stitch. Inside Tourelle, the chaplain John Badby scrambled for his book of hours. He thumbed to Revelation, half expecting a note about teenage girls on pale horses. He found only beasts and trumpets. Trumpets they had heard, beasts they were not prepared for. Joan advanced at a walk. She wanted them to watch. Wanted each heartbeat between strides to bang like a drum in their ears. Wanted the idea of her to arrive before the infantry, the way thunder precedes artillery in stories told to frighten recruits. The first French cannon belched. Stoneball smashed the parapet near the southwest tower. Dust geysered. English soldiers ducked, then looked back to the field, and she was closer. Like a bishop in chess, banners don't move fast, they move inexorably. Behind her, French ranks progressed with unusual poise. They saw the arrows ignore her, saw enemy fortitude buckle, and borrowed that confidence the way freezing men borrow fire. A chevalier muttered, "Never thought linen could break stone." On the wall, Captain William Glasdale spat and tried to rally. "She bleeds like any farmer's daughter," he yelled. But memories surfaced. Days earlier, he had seen her ride along the riverbank, arrows thick as locusts, and not one found flesh. Superstition breeds faster than plague. Glasdale ordered a man to take the girl down. The archer, Thomas Tuffy, swore under his breath, drew, loosed. The shaft flew straight toward the maid's throat and hit the banner pole instead, lodging like a tooth in wood. Joan lifted the flag, arrow dangling, as if displaying a gift. The French roared. The English recoiled. Symbols, she understood, wrote their own gospels. She halted just beyond bow range. Horse breath gusted. She turned the mare in a slow circle so every pair of enemy eyes could measure her youth, her calm, her apparent invulnerability. Then, voice clear as church bells, she addressed them in French, too crisp for peasants and loud enough for God. "Go home, tend your fields, leave France to the French, and your souls to heaven, before this river baptizes you in blood." The insult was less in the words than in the lips that formed them. A woman's lips, unchapped by fear. The English answered with curses, yet nobody knocked another arrow. Joan wheeled the mare, trotted back. The French lines parted to swallow her, closing like a gate behind myth. Inside, La Hire barked orders, ladders forward, gunners reload, crossbowmen pick gaps. But Joan said nothing. Her work for the moment was done. She had delivered doubt like plague rats over the wall. Inside Tourelle, doubt metastasized. Archers wiped palms slick with sweat. Kitchen boys whispered that devils wore pretty faces. Glasdale inspected arrow stockpiles as though quantity might cure dread. Badby prayed louder, hoping volume could drown uncertainty. When the full assault finally came, cannons, ladders, smoke, English resistance cracked quicker than commanders predicted. Men who had withstood starvation and disease balked at facing a girl whose banner seemed to drink their arrows. Some fought, many merely retreated deeper, as if square footage could repel a miracle. At twilight, the fort's inner yard was awash with surrender. Glasdale cursed Joan from a window until flames cut his words short. He fell into the Loire, armor dragging him under. Stories later claimed the maid had wept for his soul. Truth. She had blinked smoke from her eyes and whispered a prayer, uncertain if it was pity or exhaustion. As French soldiers raised her banner atop the captured tower, they didn't shout. They exhaled, a collective relief that felt almost private. Victory was loud. Vindication rang strangely quiet. Word galloped upriver faster than any scout. The witch girl walks through storms of iron. Forts crumble at her shadow. God has picked sides. English outposts listened, weighed morality against mortality, and chose the safer of two hells: retreat. That night, by campfire light, Joan scrubbed wood splinters from her palms, where the banner pole had kicked back each time an arrow struck. The skin was raw, but no blood. Small magic after the day's theater. Etienne asked if she knew the men thought her untouchable. "Tomorrow they'll see the bruises," she said, smiling thin. "But tonight, let them dream." She gazed at the captured tower silhouetted against the stars. Somewhere in that darkness, English survivors were retelling the day, adding polish, adding fright, forging myth on the anvil of fear. Good. Propaganda is cheaper than siege engines and Mint's coin of courage for both buyer and seller. In her tent, the saints arrived late, almost sheepish. "Tactics well played," murmured Catherine. "Courage well rationed," Margaret said. Michael merely grunted approval, like a blacksmith satisfied with a blade. Joan lay back, armor off, linen sleeves rolled to expose bruised forearms. Her body hurt like a church after Easter, but she felt the ripple her presence had sent into enemy hearts. The world had learned a new arithmetic. 1 girl plus 1 horse equaled 1,000 swords, provided the story was told correctly. And as campfires dwindled, Joan prayed not for strength but for symbolism, asking heaven to keep her terrifying a little longer, just long enough to make surrender feel inevitable. Fear, after all, is history's fastest courier, and tonight it rode wherever her legend pointed. The night after Tourelle surrendered, the air in camp tasted of smoke and unfinished prayers. Victory meant new logistics: bury the dead, mend the walls, find bread somewhere between ash heaps. Amid the bustle, Joan requested ink. A scribe named Arnaud brought a quill, lamp, and 1 precious sheet of parchment. "Only 1?" she asked. "Paper costs more than sin," he answered. She nodded. Scarcity sharpens intention. She knelt on a crate outside her tent, banner folded beside her like a slumbering hound. Arnaud poised the quill. "To whom, maid?" "To the enemy," she said, "and to every soul still unsure whether I'm nightmare or miracle." Arnaud swallowed. "Very well." She dictated slowly, her Lorraine vowels pacing each line like a drumbeat. "You, men of England, who call yourselves guardians of France by right of conquest, you have sat too long on soil that mourns your boots. Withdraw, and I shall spare your lives. Stay, and God will judge, and I will be his verdict." Arnaud's hand trembled. The phrase was a blade. Joan continued, voice softer now, yet weightier. "Think of mothers who sew shrouds before their sons leave home. Think of bread ovens gone cold because bakers march with arrows in their backs. Think of priests burying children they just baptized. The quill scratched like a bone saw." She concluded, "This is not hatred, but warning. France is a garden that resents foreign footprints. Return to your island, sow peace there, linger here, and the Loire will remember your names only as ripples. Jehan la Pucelle, written at Orléans, where even the crows now speak French." Arnaud lifted the parchment, reading silently. A veteran passing by, scar over 1 eye, missing 2 fingers, asked what magic the girl brewed tonight. Arnaud handed him the letter. The soldier read, lips moving, and a thin line of water brightened the dust on his cheek. He handed it back without a word and walked toward the river as if needing distance to breathe. Word spread. "She's writing to the English." Men gathered in ragged semicircles, each wanting to hear. Arnaud cleared his throat and recited. The night, so recently rowdy with victory songs, fell hush-steeped. Flames popped, steel settled, even horses stilled their chains. When the scribe reached the final line, several things happened at once. A crossbowman crossed himself. La Hire muttered a profanity that sounded suspiciously like a prayer, and a boy too young for whiskers whispered, "I hope my mother never reads words that sharp." Joan accepted the parchment, sanded it dry, and folded it twice. She pressed hot wax from the camp brazier onto the seam. Instead of a signet ring, she had none. She stamped the blob with the hilt of her sword, leaving a crude imprint of the crossguard. Symbol enough. She handed the letter to Etienne. "Find a herald the English trust. Not one who drinks courage, one who carries it naturally." Etienne nodded, tucking the parchment inside his jerkin as though cradling a newborn. La Hire stepped forward. "Words sting, maid, but iron bleeds. Why send parchment when we have cannons?" "Because iron kills the body," she answered, "and words can kill the will. Victories won in the mind spend fewer lives in the field." La Hire grunted, unconvinced, but he didn't argue. He had seen men break at rumor alone. At first light, Etienne rode under white flag across the battered bridge. The English, raw-eyed and resentful, allowed him through after frisking him twice for concealed blades or devil tricks. He returned at noon, letterless, cheeks pale. "They laughed," he said. Then one read it aloud. The laughter stopped. Some cursed. One knelt to pray. Captain Talbot crumpled it, but kept it. "Good," Joan said. "What Talbot keeps will keep him awake." That afternoon, scouts reported unusual quiet from the next English fort upstream. No taunts, no banner shifts, just the distant echo of an argument. By dusk, a trio of soldiers deserted across the river, arms raised. They wanted no pay, only passage home. Interrogated, they confessed the letter's words had traveled faster than ferry boats. Some Englishmen doubted it came from a woman. Others feared exactly that. A prophecy delivered in a girl's voice felt like scripture rewritten by lightning. One deserter recited a passage from memory, voice cracked. "Think of mothers who sew shrouds before their sons leave home." He wept half through it. Lahire watched, stunned. "I've seen men gutted without tears," he muttered. "What in hell did you lace that ink with?" "Hell?" Joan repeated. "Number just a mirror. Sometimes reflection is scarier than blades." 2 days later, a royal courier arrived from Chinon with a sealed missive. The Dauphin had heard rumors of the letter and demanded a copy. Joan obliged, though she wondered if Charles would recognize the blunt mercy at its core. Power hears threats more clearly than compassion. Arnaud penned a duplicate. Before sealing, he asked, "Shall I soften the phrasing for royal taste?" "Leave every splinter," Joan said. "A king who can't stomach truth should abdicate to someone who can chew." That night, soldiers huddled around small fires, repeating lines as though warding charms. Without official decree, the letter became part of their kit. Arrow, shield, canteen, sentence. Some carved phrases onto scabbards, others traced them on wrist wraps in charcoal. A pikeman composed a crude song, the melody awful, the chorus unforgettable. Joan listened from the shadows, knees hugged to chest, feeling the strange ache of influence. Battles she could map, words once loosed found their own frontiers. The saints arrived late, a choir beneath the stars. "Courage can be ink," Catherine observed. "Mercy spoken sharply, cleaves pride," Margaret added. Michael, terse. "Let the river carry fear downstream." Joan closed her eyes, hearing not saints now, but distant English camps, restless where they once slept smug. She pictured Talbot lying awake, letter unfolded, staring at lines that glowed hotter than campfire. If tomorrow's field saw fewer swords raised, a sheet of parchment would deserve a place beside cannon wrought iron. If it saw the same blood, at least the dead would know someone tried warning the reaper. She rose, brushed straw from her leggings, and whispered into the dark, "Words ride faster than horses." May they outrun grief. Wind caught the banner overhead. Silk thumped softly like the turning of a page. War measures rations in heartbeats. On the march to Jargeau, each French soldier carried a satchel no heavier than hope. A rough rye loaf, a strip of bacon gone gray with salt, an onion so shriveled it rattled, a flask of sour wine doctored with whatever herbs a campwife could forage. Luxury was anything that didn't break teeth. Joan's share fit in one hand. She inspected the bread first, hard as penance, speckled with weevils. A tap of her fingernail rang like a shield. Etienne offered to trade his slightly softer slice. She declined. Miracles shouldn't play favorites with crumbs. Morning fog clung to the column. Far ahead, Lahire argued for a midday halt to roast the last pig. "Better eaten by friends than by worms," he said. The quartermaster warned that smoke drew arrows and full bellies bred sleep. Joan overruled them both. No fire, no feast, only silence to chew. By noon, the sun burned through mist, revealing wheat fields flattened by months of skirmish, golden heads waiting to become corpses instead of bread. Joan dismounted, cut a handful of stalks with her dagger, peeled a single kernel, and let starch and sunlight mingle on her tongue. Grain tasted of potential. She swallowed it whole like a promise. Etienne frowned at her near-empty stomach. She told him fasting sharpened the senses, truth wrapped in theology. Saints rarely arrived on full bellies. That night they camped beneath Jargeau's walls, ash from the last skirmish still drifting like dirty snow. A wagon with a crucifix nailed to its side served as chapel and kitchen. Communion bread the color of cobwebs was offered only to officers. Joan slipped her slice to a trembling boy archer. Authority sometimes tasted like stale flour. Later, behind the wagon, she found a bucket of pig-fat scraps and swallowed a fistful without chewing. Salt stung her cracked lips. Grease slid down her throat. Room temperature absolution. She wiped her mouth with a steel-clad wrist, leaving a smear that looked like burnt chrism. There were foods she could never touch. More than 1 cup of wine, lest a tipsy prophet feed cynics. Sweetmeats, too decadent for a messiah in mail. Garlic on fast days, priests said it masked not just breath, but humility. Most forbidden of all was the Dauphin's venison pâté, a court delicacy that traveled with royal envoys. Rumor of indulgence could sour her saintly image. She smelled it once, rich with cloves, and wondered if holiness required monotony. The saints answered with silence. Lesson enough. On the eve of assault, she ordered vats of thin onion soup for every soldier. A single onion could season a gallon of water. Poverty has its own recipes. Steam stung her eyes with memories of Domremy, her mother humming while winter wind rattled the shutters. Joan skipped the shards of bread floating on top. When La Hire warned that a general who starves before battle bleeds early, she replied that an overstuffed heart can't hear heaven. He grunted and pressed a rind-hard strip of cheese into her hand. She chewed it slowly, feeling strength bloom like coaxed embers. That night, saints arrived sooner than usual, drawn perhaps by the emptiness echoing in her ribs. Between their counsels, her own body whispered of muscle and marrow and the mortal price of abstinence. She slipped to the supply cart, sliced a hunk of bread, dipped it into congealed bacon grease, and ate standing beneath the moon. Salt, smoke, guilt, gratitude. She prayed that spirit and sinew would not betray one another. Before dawn, she gathered the captains. On a dirt map scratched with a stale crust, she traced assault lines. When she snapped the crust in half and handed a piece to La Hire, recognition flared in his eyes. Victory would be shared sustenance. She popped the last bite into her mouth, speaking around it. Blasphemy of manners that felt deliciously human. "Eat now," she told them. "Battle devours appetite." Hunger still coiled inside, but no longer hissed. Tamed for the moment, a war horse awaiting saddle. She hefted the banner, its weight like unswallowed bread, nourishing and burdensome at once. Somewhere behind the Dauphin's entourage, venison pâté waited for a safer tomorrow. She laughed softly. One day victory might taste sweet, but today it tasted of grease-kissed crust and onion steam. Hooves stamped impatience. Joan swung into the saddle, pain flickering briefly in her empty stomach. She welcomed it. On an empty belly, even doubt must march light, and there was a city to take before anyone tasted anything better than survival. They called her blessed at sunrise and bewitched by dusk. One victory too many had twisted praise into panic. Nothing frightens authority like a miracle that refuses to stay conveniently improbable. Jargeau's walls still smoldered behind them when the army pushed east through mud that sucked at their boots. Joan rode at the front, banner limp from drizzle, armor streaked with ash. The infantry swapped jokes, half relief, half disbelief, while farther back clerks and campwives whispered that heaven never plays favorites for long. Win once and you are Providence. Win twice and you are suspicious. Win a third time and surely you traffic in darker currencies. The midday halt came in a rain-blurred meadow. Joan crouched beside a cook fire, turning her sodden boots to the heat while rumors circled. If she failed tomorrow, it would prove God's patience had limits. If she won, the devil must be courting France for his own banner. A Dominican friar trudged past, muttering that holy women bled humility, not Englishmen. An armorer delivered a new gorget only after crossing himself 3 times, testing whether consecrated iron would scorch her skin. Joan kissed the engraved cross, buckled it on, and told him to forge more, for the doubters. Lightning forked overhead, framing her silhouette in white fire. A pikeman dropped to his knees, convinced the storm crowned her. His comrade spat that lightning favors tall metal, but his voice shook all the same. Fear and awe fenced in every direction. Joan kept her eyes on the horizon, measuring the sky for weak spots. Conversation wastes miracles. The camp settled beneath dripping pines. 4 captured English boys, deserters barely older than Etienne, were hauled in as possible spies. Generals argued for a quick hanging. Joan questioned them gently about their parishes and their mothers' illnesses, then freed them with bread and directions to the nearest ford. Some cheered her mercy, others muttered that witches charm with kindness before striking. Jacques Bonnivet, the Dauphin's paymaster and hobby heresiologist, drafted a complaint accusing her of sorcery by seduction. La Hire nearly choked on ale, barking that if bread were witchcraft, the whole army was damned. Night spread like ink. Joan wandered the lines, catching snatches of argument, saint or sorceress, blessing or bait. She paused beside a knot of soldiers. "If fear of damnation weighs more than fear of arrows," she said, "I can't help you. I fight one war at a time." An old sergeant bowed. "We follow your banner. God can sort our paperwork later." She squeezed his shoulder. "He will, but let's give him something worth stamping." In her tent, Etienne dozed over unfinished reports. A single candle trembled on the crate that served as desk. Outside, the canvas rippled with wind. Inside, the saints arrived thin-voiced, as if traveling through heavier weather than rain. Catherine sighed that untested courage breeds slander. Margaret urged that tomorrow would test everyone. Michael showed her only a flash of Orleans Cathedral, drenched in sunrise, promise or warning. Joan pricked her finger, let one drop hiss onto the candle flame. "Blood extinguishes nothing tonight," she whispered, then blew out the light and listened to the dark breathe. Trumpets sounded before first light. Armor clanged, horses stamped, prayers tumbled like dice onto mud. Overnight, a rumor had sprung up. An English astrologer had charted her downfall for this very morning. Another claimed a French bishop would excommunicate her if she captured one more fortress. Joan mounted, feeling every bruise earned since Domremy. Hundreds of faces flickered between veneration and dread, cursed if she failed, witched if she won. She raised the banner. "If I burn," she called, "let the flames light your path. If I triumph, remember who hands me the match." A ragged cheer answered, half plea, half roar. Mud and prophecy churned under hooves as the column rolled forward. The gray horizon cracked to pale gold. Joan felt the impossible bind embrace her like a second cuirass. Lose, and she proved herself false. Win, and she proved herself unnatural. Either way, she would serve as proof. Which lesson France chose to learn was never hers to decide. She leaned over the mare's neck and murmured, "Forward, little sister." Behind her, the army followed, driven by equal parts faith and fear, history's favorite horses, yoked to the same impossible cart. The Dauphin's court smelled of beeswax, velvet, and calculations. After Jargeau, Joan rode north to Loches, where Charles lingered behind stone walls thick enough to muffle bad news. Soldiers parted for her, but courtiers blocked the corridors like embroidery come alive. Brocaded sleeves, wary eyes, hands hidden near daggers or rosaries depending on the gossip of the hour. She dismounted in the outer ward and felt mud harden on her boots, while stewards debated whether a peasant girl in armor could tread the parquet floors. Etienne whispered that victory's perfume fades fast in halls where power ferments. Joan only adjusted her banner. Silk and lilies answer most dress codes. Inside the great chamber, Charles lounged beneath tapestries of saints he rarely imitated. His smile was thin as parchment. His advisors' smiles were thinner still. They had summoned her as savior, yet greeted her like a debt come due. She knelt. Charles bid her rise with a flick of ring-heavy fingers. "They say you walk through arrows," he murmured. "I prefer doors," Joan replied. A ripple of nervous laughter darted among the courtiers, then hid behind sleeves. La Tremoille, fox-eyed, stepped forward. "The maid requests fresh troops and coin to press her advantage." He pronounced it as if advantage were an uncertain rumor. Joan met the minister's gaze. "France pressed her advantage the moment she remembered she was alive," she said. "I merely pointed out the pulse." Charles tapped his scepter against his knee. "Coin is scarce, men scarcer. Why should I gamble what little I have left on another march?" "Because God gambled first," Joan answered. "He staked prophecy. All you risk is silver." A bishop in lilac silk cleared his throat. "Prophecy's interest rate is brutal if defaulted," he warned. Joan turned to him. "Then let's pay it with action, not excuses." Murmurs broke like surf. Some heard audacity, others heard lèse majesté. Charles studied her, weighing faith against treasury columns. Finally, he sighed, half capitulation, half fatigue. "What do you need?" "Men who still believe they have blood to spend," Joan said. "Gunpowder enough to make the English stutter, and your presence at Rheims to remind the crown it has a head." Silence. Rheims lay deep in enemy territory. The Coronation Road was a gauntlet lined with ambush and doubt. Yet monarchs, like miracles, are useless if never seen. Charles looked past her toward the tall windows glazed with pale mourning. "If I ride and fail, I lose a throne. If I stay and you succeed without me, I lose a kingdom in rumor." "Then ride," Joan said gently. "Let rumor gallop beside us, not ahead." He rose, slow, but he rose. At his gesture, a clerk unfurled a parchment of royal orders. Levies called, guns hired, coffers cracked open. As the seal pressed hot wax, Joan felt the room tilt. Power had shifted, not to her, but through her, like current through iron. Later, in a drafty corridor, La Tremoille cornered her. "Every king who leans on saints ends up on unstable legs," he hissed. "Remember Thomas Becket. Becket bled for heaven. Kings bled for his memory," Joan replied. "Choose whose example you fear." He stepped back as if singed. Politics has its own armor, but prophecy sometimes slides between the plates. That night, celebration masqueraded as supplication. Priests sang Te Deum. Lords toasted with wine sweeter than morale. Joan stood at the edge of candlelight, helmet tucked under one arm, listening to a minstrel compose verses about her hair shining brighter than Damascus steel. She nearly laughed. Her hair was greasy with March dust and smelled of tallow. Myth didn't care for hygiene. A court lady in silver silk approached, eyes soft with either pity or intrigue. "They say you never danced," she whispered. Joan shook her head. "Battlefields don't play the right music." The lady offered a gloved hand anyway. Joan declined. Gauntlets are clumsy on parquet, and prophecy keeps poor rhythm. While nobles spun beneath chandeliers, she slipped outside to the star-lit courtyard. The sky above Loches was unusually clear. No gunpowder haze, no English beacons. She breathed deep, tasting freedom that felt temporary, like church incense moments after Mass. The saints arrived quick, urgent. Catherine praised the day's diplomacy. Margaret cautioned that courts sharpen daggers faster than swords. Michael spoke only one word: coronation. The syllable rang like an anvil strike in her ribs. She knelt on chilled flagstones. "If France is pawn," she prayed, "move her wisely. Let no bishop's greed or minister's dread tip the board." In response, a breeze lifted her banner where it leaned against the wall, silk snapping once. Agreement enough. At dawn, the courtyard bustled with pages lashing baggage to pack horses. Joan oversaw grain rations, sling-hauled cannon, new boots for boys whose souls had vanished in mud. She checked each wagon, each cask, each trembling volunteer who signed his name on a muster roll more binding than sacrament. Charles emerged in riding cloak trimmed with just enough fur to suggest solvency. He nodded to her. Acknowledgement, reliance, the faintest edge of awe. She mounted, banner upright. Charles mounted beside her. Across the yard, courtiers watched, calculating odds. Some crossed themselves. Others counted coin to wager at whatever table fate set next. Trumpets sounded. Gates creaked open. Joan's mare stepped out first, hoofbeats echoing against stone. Behind her rolled artillery, wagons, reluctant magnificence. Above, banners of lilies snapped bright as unspent hope. As the column wound into the valley mist, Joan tasted tomorrow. Gun smoke, candle wax, chrism oil poured on a monarch's brow. Victory's strange recipe. Ahead lay Rheims, and a crown still waiting for its wearer, but also snares laid by men who feared any throne blessed by a woman's hand. God's soldier rode at the Dauphin's side. France's pawn rode beneath unseen fingers that nudged kings and bishops alike. She could only move forward, one square at a time, praying the board held steady long enough for checkmate. Rouen wakes to church bells and wet wood. Dawn paints the Seine a grudging gray, fog so thick it muffles even the gossip. In the castle, Keep Joan stands shackled, chain colder than conscience, listening to guards argue about breakfast. One wants salted herring, the other says fish stinks worse than heresy. Neither looks her in the eyes. She has not slept. Sleep would mean surrendering the last witness inside her skull. Instead, she tracked every hour by candle gutter. One for confession, one for interrogation, one for the sound of carpenters sawing a new stake because yesterday's cracked in transport. She wonders if saints feel time or merely observe it. The cell door clanks. Brother Martin Ladvenu enters with wafer-thin courage and a missile heavy as guilt. "They will come soon," he whispers. He offers a scrap of bread, softer than prison straw. She breaks it, gives him half. Mercy tastes the same no matter who chews it. Steps echo. Soldiers, clerks, the English sheriff trying to look impartial. They unlock her chains and bind her wrists with rope instead. Symbolism prefers fiber over iron. Outside, the courtyard smells of damp straw and unwashed armor. Rain has stopped, but threatens like second thoughts. The platform waits in the market square, fenced by lances turned upside down. At its center rises the stake, oak, too green to burn clean. Beneath it, tinder of faggots, barrels of pitch, and a scattering of sulfur to hurry God's will. Somewhere, an official recorded the inventory, as if salvation were an invoice. Crowds gather in layers, English soldiers up front, spears crossed, Norman townsfolk behind them, children hoisted onto shoulders, French sympathizers further back, faces hidden by hoods. Joan hears murmurs ripple like wind through drying linen. Is she really 19? 17 when they made her general. Too young for martyr, too old for miracle. Clerics precede her with a placard. Relapsed heretic, idolater, sorceress, apostate. The words wobble in the breeze, ink bleeding into cheap wood. She wonders whether the sign will burn with her or be saved for someone else's neck. At the foot of the scaffold, she stumbles, ankle iron bruised from months of fetters. 2 guards catch her. One spits at the ground as if contact risks contamination. She thanks them anyway. Courtesy costs less than contempt. Up the ladder, step by step, every hinge squealing like a guilty verdict. The executioner, Geoffroy Tirage, waits pale as parchment. He mutters an apology she can't quite hear. She forgives him in a glance. Forgiveness is lighter than wood smoke. They tie her torso to the stake with rope thick as anchor line. Her arms pinioned, palms outward, fingers twitching, a reflex of swords, long absent. They cinch her ankles. Wind flaps her short, ragged hair against her cheeks. It smells of soot from forges, of tallow candles, of the river carrying secrets seaward. A friar mounted on a crate reads the formal sentence. Words tumble, schism, error, relapse. Yet all Joan hears is bone against oak as she shifts for balance. She interrupts once. Hold the cross higher so I may see it. A soldier, startled, lifts a small crucifix. She fixes on the tiny Christ. Wood recognizes wood. Below, the executioner lights a brand. The first tongue of flame is small, almost polite, but pitch catches quickly. Heat climbs in pulses, smoke snakes around her boots before her vision. The smell arrives before the pain. Pitch tar first, sharp as broken promises, then sulfur, the egg-rot stench of the underworld. Finally, wool and flesh, acrid, sweet, unclean, unmistakable. A burned girl smells like candles snuffed with wet fingers, like singed hair in a farmhouse stove, like every harvest bonfire gone suddenly wrong. Joan coughs, smoke claws her throat, stealing prayers mid-syllable. She tries twice, manages one phrase, Jesus. The name falters but hangs in air thicker than any banner she ever carried. Flames lick the hem of her dress. Fabrics flash bright, then blacken and peel. Heat bites through skin, turns nerves into singing wires. She shakes once, instinct overriding rope, but bonds hold. A soldier looks away. Another forces himself to watch, cowardice wearing duty's mask. Somewhere a woman screams for them to end it quickly. A man answers that quickness cheats justice. Debate mingles with crackle. Philosophy burns poorly. Her face lifts to the sky, eyes watering not from terror, but from smoke so dense it writes its own scripture. She cannot see the saints, but she feels them crowd the margins of consciousness. Catherine's mercy, Margaret's steel, Michael's thunder held in check. None speak. On the threshold of eternity, words feel redundant. The smell deepens, marrow boiling, fat dripping onto coals with a hiss like serpents. People recoil. Even executioners know this odor will haunt their cloaks. One English captain gags behind his gauntlet and later claims it was the wind. A gust flares the fire. Flame climbs her torso, breathes through cracked leather belt, finds the banner scrap she had hidden there, and devours it in a single bright gasp. She feels pain blur into something wider, terror's horizon, then beyond it, calm so vast she almost laughs. She thinks of the Loire at night, of banners snapping above victory walls, of boys too young to shave shouting her name like a prayer they just learned. She thinks of her mother's hands, of goats on Domremy hills, of bread eaten in haste before dawn marches. She thinks, surprisingly, of the smell of wet hay, the scent that began her story and is now overwritten by smoke. Her lips move once more. Witnesses disagree on the final word: Jesus, Mary, water, light. Perhaps she said nothing. Perhaps the flame spoke for her. A crack sounds. The ropes burn through. Her body slumps against the stake, knees buckling, flames wreathing her head like unwanted sainthood. Someone throws more pitch. The fire answers greedily. Minutes stretch, then crumble. Eventually, the executioner rakes the embers, searching for signs of life to silence rumors. He finds only char and ash, and the faint imprint of a girl's ribcage branded on scorched oak. The crowd disperses, clutching memories that will keep them awake despite fatigue. The market square reeks, not of victory, not of justice, but of marrow smoke that clings to hair, to linen, to history's pages. Days later, the English sheriff orders the ashes thrown in the Seine, afraid pilgrims will harvest miracles from bone slivers. But the smell lingers in Rouen stones, in tavern rafters, in church pews polished by restless knees. People swear they still taste it when the wind shifts: burnt wool, pitch, and something human no river can rinse away. Years will pass, verdicts reverse, crowns change heads. Yet soldiers who witnessed this morning will wake at night certain they smell candles snuffed by wet fingers, certain they hear a banner crack in windless air, certain they see, just for a heartbeat, a girl on a horse riding through smoke that refuses to forget. Imagine you are 15, muddy-shoed, bone-tired, and born to a century that measures possibility by the length of a plowshare. The year is 1429. Plague stories still haunt the well, taxes gnaw every harvest, and God, so people tell you, has made peace with suffering as long as incense keeps rising. Into the village square rides a girl your age on a horse as pale as frost. She says saints speak through her mouth, and that France, bleeding and half-souled, will stand again if only you follow. Would you laugh first, or gasp? Would you glance at the priest, the bailiff, the weather-cracked crucifix above the church door, searching for cues on how to react? Faith is easier when someone older signs the receipt. The villagers of Menetou-Salon faced this test one dew-damp morning. Joan rode in with a dozen soldiers, banner high, asking for bread and a chance to preach. Word fluttered ahead of her: Orléans freed, English forts folding like rotten shutters, miracles in bloom along the Loire. The hubbub felt exaggerated, the way stories grow fat on the road, but the excitement still pricked at ribs that rarely felt anything but hunger. The town council, 5 men who administered tithes and arguments, ambled out to meet her. She dismounted. Armor creaked, yet her grin looked like something borrowed from childhood. A blacksmith muttered that saints do not grin. His wife elbowed him. Saints also do not carry swords tall as broomsticks, yet here they were. Joan thanked the council for hospitality they hadn't offered yet, then spoke of crowns and coronations, of a kingdom stitched back together if enough common hearts beat in unison. She sounded less like a prophet and more like a plowgirl who'd memorized a troubadour's boast. Still, every sentence rang with that unnerving certainty, iron hammered flat. A baker asked the question that lived in every throat. "Why you?" She answered, "Because no one else came." Simple as bread, terrifying as famine. Silence spread, sticky as spilled ale. A child near the well giggled, cutting the tension. Children sense when adults wobble on the cliff edge of change. Joan turned, smiled, and handed the kid her glove, fingers still warm. The child gawked at embroidered crosses, proof that wonder sometimes weighs less than leather. The priest, Father Roland, found his voice. He reminded everyone the church frowns on women in men's garb and on visions unvetted by bishops. Joan listened, head tilted, as though enjoying birdsong. When he finished, she asked gently, "Did God consult bishops before speaking to Abraham?" The priest's rebuttal died of sudden shyness. Old Guillaume Montpierre, a farmer curved like a question mark, shuffled forward. His son had died at Agincourt. His grandson now drilled under English banners for a crust. "Promise me," he croaked, "that if I believe, the pain stops." Joan knelt in the mud, armor biting her knees, and answered, "Believe, and the pain finds purpose. That is all God ever bargains." Somewhere behind, an English spy, there was always at least one, scribbled notes for his captain. The maid coaxes peasants with honeyed scripture. Danger lies not in her sword, but her voice. He spelled scripture wrong, nerves shake spelling loose. As afternoon light angled gold, Joan requested a small mass. Father Roland hesitated, then opened the church. Inside, wood pews smelled of dust and last winter's damp. She prayed aloud in French so clear it scoured cobwebs from the rafters. Villagers knelt because they always knelt, but this time a tremor of expectation threaded through the hush. Maybe the floor would glow. Maybe angels would descend. Maybe they'd at least leave smelling less of goat. Nothing miraculous happened, unless you count the way skepticism thinned with every Ave. After Mass, Joan handed her sword belt to the blacksmith. "Sharpen this," she said. "Payment is your blessing." He did, edge glistening, still half certain he was feeding a myth its teeth. Night found torches along the main road, Joan's troop setting camp. She sat by the fire with merchants, laughing at a joke about bishops and barrels. Laughter traveled farther than torches. Villagers edged closer, pretending to fetch water. Listening turned to questions. Questions turned to offers. A wheel of cheese, a bolt of linen, a skinny rooster pressed into Etienne's startled arms. Before dawn, she mounted again. Half the village lined the street, sleep-crusted but electric. Father Roland gave a shy benediction. Old Montpierre bowed so low his spine popped. The baker promised bread en route to Rheims. Children waved makeshift flags, bedsheets painted with shaky lilies. The troop rode off, hoofbeats muffled by early mist. Only when the last banner tip vanished did folks notice how quiet the square felt, as if someone had siphoned off the usual complaints. Doubt would return. Taxes, weather, foreign steel. But for a few breaths, they floated, untethered from resignation. Days later, an English patrol seized Joan's blacksmith-sharpened sword near Meung. The captain remarked it cut cleaner than any he'd seen, proof, he said, of demonic aid. The blacksmith, hauled before magistrates, insisted it was plain forging, same as always. In truth, the hammer swings that night had held an odd rhythm: fear, hope, curiosity, clang. Fear, hope, curiosity, clang. Metal remembers intention. Maybe edges do too. Back in Manitou Salon, market chatter still ends with a shrug toward the road. Remember when the maid rode through? Some claim the rooster laid an egg big as a fist the next day. Omen, obviously. Others insist the church pews smell different now, like candle wax rather than mildew. Children pretend their reed spears are banner poles. Mothers pretend they aren't proud. And you, 15, mudshod, future uncertain, would you believe, or would you need proof forged in iron and smoke, proof you could touch without burning? Faith rarely offers that courtesy. Most times it arrives on a frost-white horse, spoken by a voice barely older than your own, handing you a glove that smells of sweat and something you dare to call holy. Belief, then, is a decision made in the unlit corners of the heart, the way a seed decides to split underground. Some seeds wake, some rot. The field remembers both as part of the harvest. Legend says the maid found it buried beneath loose flagstones in a little chapel at Sainte Catherine de Fierbois. The truth is both simpler and stranger. The chapel sits where two dusty roads cross like frayed shoelaces, its walls patched with stones of at least 3 vanished eras. Pilgrims stop for Catherine's blessing, merchants for her shade, deserters for a hiding place no quartermaster thinks to search. By the spring of 1429, the place also sheltered a very tired teenage commander whose sword edge had chipped on Tourelle's oaken gates. Joan arrived at dusk with 5 companions and a petition that felt half mad even to her. The saints say there is a blade waiting for me here. The priest, Father Basile, bowed because best-selling miracles always start polite. He confessed the sacristy held nothing sharper than candle snuffers, but the maid smiled as if he had confirmed directions. Candles sputtered along the nave. She knelt on cold paving stones, glitter of mail dull in the tobacco-colored light. Closing her eyes, she listened, not for voices this time, but for hush, the way a smith listens to steel cooling. The hush pointed east toward the choir steps. Etienne prized up the first flagstone with a crowbar borrowed from the stable. Dust breathed out like an old sigh. Beneath lay loam soft as altar bread, and, 2 handspans down, the cross-guard of a sword, iron blackened by centuries of sermons overhead. It was no Arthurian shimmer, only a weapon long neglected, straight blade, single fuller, plain-lobed pommel. Yet when Etienne tugged, the earth gave it up like a secret overdue. Rust scaled off in crumbs, a line of runic stamps winked briefly before vanishing under new tarnish. Joan took it, weighed it, and something inside the church shifted, as if stone remembered the hymn it was quarried to echo. Father Basile crossed himself twice. "I never knew," he whispered. Joan answered, "Neither did the sword." Word galloped quicker than logic. By breakfast, soldiers swore the blade glowed. By noon, merchants claimed it once belonged to Charlemagne. By nightfall, monks argued over which angel forged it. Joan cleaned it with sand, oil, and silence, refusing to name it anything but a tool. A relic too holy invites idolatry, and she had no wish to compete with her own hardware. Yet myth grew fungal. On the march north, the troops treated the sword like parole stamped on iron. Crossbow strings tightened truer, pikes lowered steadier. Prayers tasted less like obligation and more like possibility. When enemies glimpsed it glinting above the melee, they hesitated that heartbeat long enough for arrows to find an opening. Charles's advisors, eager to bottle lightning, asked if the blade had provenance certificates, saints' affidavits perhaps. Joan smiled thin. "Its proof is what it cuts." They wrote that down, not sure whether it was humility or marketing. At Guion, during a lull, a blacksmith offered to buff away the remaining rust. Joan declined. Scars on steel remind flesh of its own unclipped frailty. She did let him hone the edge. Watching sparks cascade, she wondered if the unseen smith who forged it centuries before imagined this future, imagined a girl wielding his workmanship against foreign spears. Probably he only imagined rent money and good weather for the quenching. Late one night, by riverbank fire, La Hire finally asked the question simmering in every captain's gaze. "Do you trust that thing more than the banner?" Joan studied the sword, then the linen lilies folded on her saddle. "One shows them why to fight," she said. "The other shows them how." La Hire grunted assent. Philosophy tastes better when paired with wine. Some men called it destiny that the blade emerged the week before the coronation march. Others called it stagecraft. An English pamphleteer, clever with scare woodcuts, depicted the maid pulling Excalibur from a cauldron of hellfire. French taverns nailed the print beside wine prices, the better to toast its absurdity. The real miracle was subtler. The sword fit her hand. Not the measurements, those were ordinary, but the balance, the way recoil settled into her wrist as if the blade wished to swing further than her arm allowed. During drills, she found parries flowing sharper, cuts landing surer. Maybe it remembers being needed, she told Etienne. He replied that memory is a luxury steel cannot afford. She laughed. Sometimes pages distill the deeper theology. When Reims finally loomed, its towers butter-colored in midsummer glare, Joan rode at the Dauphin's right. Banner in left fist, church floor sword in right, she looked, according to more than one breathless royal chronicler, like Judgment Day arriving early for an inspection tour. In truth, she was hungry, saddle-sore, and deeply worried about lice in her hair, but optics rarely paused to fact-check. Inside the cathedral, as Charles prepared to kneel, Joan handed the sword to the archbishop without ceremony. He blinked at the mud-stained relic, uncertain whether to cradle or consecrate it. "Hold it until the oil dries," she whispered. "Let steel rest while crowns rise." He obeyed, gripping the hilt as though fearing it might critique the sermon. When the choir thundered Te Deum, Joan scarcely glanced at the crown descending to Charles's brow. Her gaze fixed on the blade propped against the altar rail, quietly reflecting candlelight with the patience of objects that outlive owners. She realized then the saints had not given her a weapon. They had given her a reminder that history's sharpest edges often wait invisible beneath the ordinary, till faith or folly prize them free. After the coronation feast, bread coarse but jubilation airy, she retrieved the sword. The archbishop tried to bless it again. She stopped him gently. "It already knows its purpose," she said. "Additional ink will only smear the script." Onward they marched, crown secured, but war unfinished. Each skirmish wrote new nicks into the resurrected steel, and each nick rewrote rumor. English scouts reported the maid wielded relics allergic to their mail. French children whittled sticks to mimic its silhouette. Charles's treasurer whispered about displaying it as a holy treasure after the campaign. Joan replied that swords retired to glass cases become mirrors for vanity, not tools of grace. The night before the march on Paris, she rested the blade across her knees, whetstone hissing. Etienne watched sparks ring the darkness. "Do you think," he asked, "we'll bury it again someday?" Joan paused, edge gleaming like future blood. "If peace lasts long enough," she said, "let it sleep. But bury it shallow, so some other fool with saints in her ears can wake it when the world forgets itself." She set the stone aside, tested a thumb against the edge, and felt the smallest bead of blood bloom, proof the sword was neither holy nor harmless, merely ready. She wiped it on her sleeve, sheathed the blade, and lay down under stars that looked sharp enough to slice open a promise. In the hush before sleep, saints murmured approval mild as distant bells. Steel, they reminded her, is only ever the middle of the story. The beginning is faith, and the ending belongs to whatever hands dare claim the hilt next. Joan closed her eyes, wondering whether legends rust or just wait, patient beneath tomorrow's flagstones, for another absurd believer to come looking. Rouen dawn blushed pale as parchment, when Brother Martin Ladvenu slipped through the prison passage with a chalice trembling in his hands. The corridors reeked of damp straw and yesterday's verdict. Somewhere below, a blacksmith hammered together the final iron hoop for the stake, every clang a countdown. Joan sat on her cot, ankles still shackled, but posture unnervingly straight. She had not slept. Her eyes looked scraped clean by a night of prayer. When Ladvenu entered, She smiled as if greeting a late guest to supper. He knelt, breath clouding in the chill. "They have granted you confession," he whispered, voice shaking like a guttering candle. Joan's smile turned grateful, almost maternal. "Then let us hurry," she said. "Men outside build a sermon of wood." The guard unlocked her wrists and stood back, discomfort bottled behind indifference. Joan rubbed circulation into her fingers, then made the sign of the cross with deliberate slowness, as though each motion stitched another second of life. They walked the narrow stairs to a chapel no larger than a pantry. Bare altar, cracked icon of the Madonna, wax puddles hardened like forgotten intentions. Joan knelt on stone colder than mercy. Brother Ladvenu opened his missal and began the ancient litany, Confiteor Deo Omnipotenti. His Latin quavered. Joan supplied the next line, calm as a schoolmistress, and the prayer found its rhythm. She confessed impatience, moments of vanity, a stole once borrowed without leave, anger at a mule that refused a cart. Then her voice dipped softer. Doubt during solitary nights, fury when men used God as armor for cowardice, terror she might mistake her own will for heaven's. Tears threatened the friar. Joan reached to steady the chalice he nearly dropped. Outside, footsteps thundered. A captain barked orders. Pikes to the square, archers to rooftops, water barrels ready in case the fire reached city beams. The stomp of preparations seeped through chapel walls like water through linen. Brother Ladvenu hurried the penitential rites, but Joan slowed him with a raised hand. "Father, let us not cheat God of proper punctuation." She finished each prayer, sealing sentences with the measured weight of someone who knows exactly how few remain. The door slammed open. Bailiff Pierre Cochon strode in, cloak flapping like a crow's wing. "It is time," he said, not unkind, but with the impatience of a man juggling schedules. Ladvenu protested, begging 10 more minutes. Cochon shook his head. "The crowd grows restless. Mercy cannot overstay protocol." Joan rose. Ladvenu offered the Eucharist. She received with steady lips, swallowing the wafer as if anchoring her soul to her tongue. She tried to sip the wine, but Cochon motioned. "No." The chalice lowered, unfinished. Thread of purple liquid trembled on the rim. A confession paused mid-sentence. Chains clicked back onto her wrists. She whispered to Ladvenu, "Tell my mother I died in grace." He nodded, tears spilling, Latin forgotten. A procession formed, guards with halberds, a clerk scribbling witness notes, a Dominican reading psalms too quickly for comfort. Joan walked barefoot. Frost bit her soles, yet she kept pace, head lifted. At the courtyard gate, she glimpsed the scaffold, stake tall as a mast, pyre stacked knee-high. She inhaled wood smoke salted with pitch, the odor of judgments that prefer spectacle. Cochon offered a final chance. Recant, wear the dress, live a life sentence. She looked at the smock clutched in his fist, fresh, coarse, surrender stitched in every seam, and shook her head. A life kneeling to fear is death with longer chores. They bound her to the stake. The crowd thrummed, English soldiers quiet from uneasy respect, townsfolk whispering prayers, children hoisted for a better view of cautionary miracle. A priest held up a cross. She fixed on the carved face of Christ until her vision blurred. Executioner Geoffroy lit the kindling. Flame licked straw, found pitch, rose with a whoosh that made onlookers step back. Smoke curled, thick and impatient. Joan began reciting the name of Jesus, steady as marching feet. Heat wove around her, singeing wool first, then grazing the hose beneath. Pain seared, but words kept marching, until a gust yanked smoke into her lungs. She coughed once, twice, voice splintering. Brother Ladvenu, weeping at the scaffold's edge, lifted a wooden cross high. Joan's eyes locked on it, lips moving without breath. The guards tried to hurry the flames, orders to add more wood. But in their haste, an ember caught a corner of her smock, flare leaping up and around. Fire roared. Her prayer cracked mid-syllable. Witnesses later argued what she managed to utter last: Jesus, Mary, water, heaven. Ladvenu heard the start of credo before smoke swallowed consonants. Cochon swore she said nothing, perhaps to soften the hush that followed. But the clerk's quill scratched a half-word, ink trailing off the page like a sparrow pulled under water. The rope at her waist burned through. Her body slumped forward against the stake, knees folding. Executioner thrust a long pole with an iron hook to pull her torso upright. Crowd must see conclusion. The hook snagged cloth, tore it. A hush shivered across onlookers at the sight of raw, blistering flesh. Even English soldiers dropped their gaze. Minutes felt like years stretched thin and screaming. When at last her head drooped slack, Geoffroy signaled, and barrels of quick lime were thrown in to rasp bone to ash. The flames coughed, billowed, settled. What remained were gray flakes spinning upward like puzzled snow. Cochon ordered the ashes gathered, loaded into a sack, flung from the bridge into the Seine. Rivers swallowed what courts feared, relics that could seed rebellion. Yet the water could not rinse the sound of a confession aborted by fire, nor the smell of charred linen that drifted over Rouen for days, haunting bakeries and taverns alike. Brother Ladvenu returned to the chapel, found the chalice still on the altar with wine half full. He knelt, drank the remainder in one gulp, and wept into his hands. Outside, vendors sold hot chestnuts to the dispersing crowd. Life, indifferent, resumed. That evening, a fisherman near the mouth of the Seine swore he saw a strip of white cloth floating upriver against the current, edges unburnt, letters too smudged to read. He netted it, but the river tugged hard as guilt and tore the scrap away. He told no one. Some stories travel heavier than boats. Thus ended the girl who rode through arrows, but her last confession never reached punctuation. It lingers, unfinished, in every ear that hears her name, an ellipsis in flame, daring history to supply the rest of the sentence. Stage lights in the 15th century were torches and gossip. Long before parchment crowned her a saint or Rouen made her smoke, Joan's story passed from campfire to court in performances polished by every tongue that told it. Even she felt the script tightening around her shoulders like armor one size too snug. On the march toward Reims, rumors outran the baggage train. She levitated over ditches, glowed while praying, turned arrows in mid-flight with a glance. Joan knew better than to correct them. Some lies fortified courage better than bread. When a shoemaker asked if she truly spoke angelic Latin, she answered in near-perfect peasant French, "I understand heaven in plain words." He bent a knee anyway. Charles's ministers saw potential box office. At Guion they arranged a spontaneous inspection. Joan crossing a hastily erected platform, white horse draped in embroidered silk, so new it still smelled of mothballs. Trumpeters blared, children scattered lilies, soldiers cheered on command. Behind a painted curtain, royal clerks took notes. Audience response, volume of applause, number of pilgrims already hawking replica banners. Joan endured it with a polite half-smile. She preferred real battles to staged ones, but a crown needed crowds the way siege ladders needed rungs. Afterward, she asked La Tremoille why the platform. He shrugged. Kings rule by spectacle, generals march by fear. You're both. She replied that the saints had not mentioned ticket sales. Theater bled into strategy one dawn outside Troy. The city walls bristled with archers. Provisions inside ran thin. Rather than starve the defenders into submission, Joan ordered torches lit, cauldrons set to boil, tents arranged in double rows, illusion of an army twice its size. She rode along the line, banner high, shouting loud enough for enemy scouts to catch wind. By noon the breach, by sunset the mass. Troyes capitulated before the first stone hurled, unwilling to test whether the girl's threats were prophecy or play acting. Charles's council praised her miraculous intimidation, then quietly circulated memoranda on repeating the trick. Behind the curtain, doubt rehearsed its own monologue. In moments alone, Joan wondered how much of her certainty was costume. Did saints truly script her lines, or was she ad-libbing courage to fill silences heaven left blank? At night, she caught herself timing speeches, selecting phrases that snapped like banners in wind. She prayed for honesty, yet used cadence as clergymen use incense, thicker when faith feels thin. Witnesses helped choreograph. A wounded knight swore she appeared on the battlements of Saint-Lô moments after being seen at the gate, a feat of either bilocation or blurred memory. Soon, soldiers claimed the maid never sweated under armor, that sunlight avoided her eyes, that her voice carried farther than trumpets. Joan's body disagreed, blisters, hoarseness, sweat in rivers, but she buttoned doubt beneath breastplate and let the legend march. The English, more literate in fear than most, counter-scripted. Pamphlets from Paris depicted her with goat hooves, serpent tail, crown of vipers. One woodcut showed her puppeteered by demons tugging strings from clouds. French taverns displayed the prince as comedy. English garrisons pinned them beside duty rosters, reminders that surrender to a witch cost eternal skin as well as temporal. Clerics examined every gesture. When Joan lifted her helmet at Reims to wipe sweat, monks argued whether the sign of the cross she made before replacing it was genuine devotion or calculated scene change. Chronicle margins fill with notes like stage directions. Exit made North Gate, enters chapel, bows to altar, audience weeps. On the coronation day, cathedral packed to timbers, Joan held Charles's banner near the altar. She could feel thousands of eyes, hear quills scratching testament into future. As the archbishop lowered the crown, she knelt, moment unscripted except by instinct. Yet a cardinal later claimed she timed the kneel perfectly to catch the shaft of light from the rose window, painting her hair halo bright. She didn't correct him. Truth is seldom as cooperative as rumor, and either way, the halo photograph existed now in hundreds of minds. After Reims, the Dauphin's treasurer proposed minting medallions. Joan on horseback, sword upraised, lilies framing her head. She vetoed the sword, better the banner, less bloodthirsty. Mint went ahead with both. Collectors prefer weaponry. But theater bills come due. Autumn, outside Paris, the play stumbled. Arrow through the thigh, armor dented, she was carried from the moat screaming for renewed assault. The council ordered retreat. Propaganda suddenly had no understudy. In taverns, whispers asked if the witch finally bled. English flyers proclaimed the devil overdue on rent. Joan saw how fast an audience flips programs to find a new star. Captured at Compiègne, shackled in a tower, she confronted the blank backstage. No armor, no banner, only stone echo and rat scuttle. Bishops pressed her to admit the performances were tricks. She refused, partly because faith forbade, partly because even stripped of costume she sensed the stage remained. Every word a cue, every silence a spotlight. At trial, prosecutors replayed scenes, seeking continuity errors. Why wear men's clothes? Why predict victory, then accept defeat? Joan answered that soldiers need symbols, and God sometimes drafts unlikely actresses. Her script faltered under Latin cross-examination, yet she held until they threatened with fire, the ultimate special effect. When flames took her, some swore a dove rose from the smoke. Others saw a demon shriek into ashes. Both visions lingered on painted glass, woodcuts, sermons. Her final line, whatever syllable escaped the smoke, entered repertoire as definitive, though transcripts disagree on vowels. Theater loves a clean exit. Reality coughed and burned. Years later, retrial clerics annulled her condemnation. Among evidence, they cited spectacular influence on morale. They meant spectacle in moral grandeur, but the term fit grease paint too. By then, Europe had restaged her story in mystery plays. Girl hears voices, lifts siege, crowns king, burns. Curtains close to him. Audience leaves convinced holiness can look like rebellion until credits roll. How much of Joan was theater? Enough to scare armies, enough to crown a reluctant prince, enough to survive centuries in echo. Not so much that her bruises were illusion, or her terror, or the marrow that sizzled in Rouen fire. Truth wore costume, costume carried truth. The stage consumed the actress, but the script keeps touring, rewritten, recast, yet still drawing crowds who whisper as lights dim that maybe the play is more documentary than they dare believe. They spoke of her most honestly when they thought she couldn't hear, voices drifting through torch-shadowed tents, over half-empty wine cups, into the patient night that eavesdrops on every boast and regret. One evening near Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier, an archer named Raoul Vermonnet described the first time he saw her ride past the baggage wagons. She was small, he said, but the air bent, the way it bends ahead of thunder. He had followed since, not out of piety, but curiosity, the same impulse that makes a boy poke a fire to see if sparks spell omens. He had expected disappointment and found orders he could believe in. Across the embers, a pikeman with one ear gone scoffed that miracles were for monks. What mattered was how she cursed in street French when a plank bridge cracked under artillery weight. "Sounded like my mother," he admitted, half fond. The men laughed. Mothers and saints live on opposite ends of the map, yet somehow she bridged the distance. A Breton knight remembered her knocking his visor shut before a charge. "Keep your eyes in," she'd snapped, "or someone will borrow them with an arrow." He'd spent the battle blinking sweat and gratitude. Now he polished the dented helm as if her fingerprints remained. Not all praise glowed. A Burgundian turncoat, now pressed into French service, muttered that her prayers rang too loud, her certainty too sharp. "We fight for coin," he groused, "and she fights for something that never jangles." Yet when the drummer called muster, he marched like everyone else, drawn by the gravitational pull of conviction masquerading as a farm girl. Their words traveled sideways through the ranks. Etienne, copying muster rolls by candle stub, recorded none of it. Testimony is slippery. But he listened. He heard how veterans who once scoffed now tucked scraps of her discarded bandage into talismans. How stable boys traced her banner on saddle leather. How cooks argued whether her appetite for onion soup portended victory or merely practical nutrition. In quiet moments, the army humanized her by assigning familiar roles. To the youngest pages, she was elder sister, stern about chores, quick with half a crust. To seasoned men, she was comrade, albeit one who prayed more fiercely than they swore. To officers, she was mascot and metric. Their strategies weighed against the question, would the maid approve? During camp inspections, she caught fragments of these assessments. They embarrassed her more than flattery from bishops. Sainthood she could place on a pedestal and ignore. Being their sister, their symbol, those were burdens that breathed. After the march on Lagny, she found a cluster of infantrymen patching arrow holes in a shield, painted with a crude likeness of her banner. One noticed her and froze. Joan knelt, took the brush, and corrected the angle of a lily without comment. The men stared as though God himself had footnoted their doodle. She handed back the brush and left before awe turned into obligation. Rumors traveled homeward faster than couriers. Mothers of recruits wrote letters thanking the maid for sparing sons from blasphemy. Wives prayed she'd keep them from brothels. Children boasted their fathers ate at her fire. In Domremy, her childhood friends debated whether she still remembered their names. A priest declared that mere knowledge of her deeds shortened purgatory by years. Theology stretched to fit the shape of longing. Yet she remained, in daily mechanics, utterly mortal. She tripped over a tent rope once. Laughter rippled until she laughed too. She despised lice and confessed it loudly while delousing her tunic. She scolded a captain for kicking a mangy dog, then fed the beast scraps until it followed the column, a limping testament to inconvenient compassion. The soldiers watched all of it, the prayers at dawn, the curses at splinters, the fatigue that made her nod off mid-strategy and wake with apologies. They assembled these pieces into a mosaic more useful than miracle. Reason to keep marching when pay wagons lagged and winter rain knifed through seams. On a frigid night outside Compiègne, word slipped along the trenches that the maid herself walked the lines barefoot, offering silent blessing. In truth, she'd loaned her boots to a courier whose soles had torn. Still, men swore they felt warmth creep up through the mud after she passed, as if belief were a small stove you carry in the chest. After her capture, the army convulsed. Some cursed heaven for borrowing its herald too soon, others cursed politics for misplacing her. One veteran sat by the Loire for hours, dipping his fingers in the current where she'd once watered her horse, as if the river kept answers in its chill. A crossbowman deserted rather than take orders from any mortal mouth again. Years later, chroniclers would comb archives for official commendations, but the truest record survived in scars and habits. A sergeant who murmured her battle psalm before every drill, an old page who taught recruits to cinch armor with her quick knot, a standard-bearer who refused wine on fast days because she once warned drunkenness dulls the edge of mercy. Ask those men why they followed, and they'd offer different truths, but the same conclusion. She made them taller inside. Not by promise of paradise or terror of damnation, but by leaning from her saddle to hand a boy a crust and saying, "Eat, you'll need strength for miracles." In that sentence they found two revelations, that miracles required strength, and that they, unlikely as they were, might supply it. So the testimonies linger, weightless yet immovable, written in margins of muster books, scratched into dagger hilts, folded into letters stained by weather and years. They declare that a peasant girl stepped into war's script and, without rewriting a line, changed the playwrights. Sister, soldier, symbol, three roles sharing one pulse, and long after banners, mildew, and chronicles fade, the echoes of those confidences will keep marching, lighter than mail, heavier than proof. The ashes cooled, the wars lingered, and France forgot its savior with a speed that would shame a plague. Not at first, of course. First came shock, then awkward gratitude expressed in half-hearted masses. But memory weighs heavier than coin. Kings balance ledgers, and Joan's name threatened to overdraw the account. Charles VII, newly crowned, still faced a kingdom in shards. He needed treaties, taxes, and clergy on side more than he needed the inconvenient ghost of a teenage peasant who had once spoken for God more clearly than any bishop in Reims. So he praised her publicly, commissioned a modest plaque in Orléans, and then let the archives close around her like silt over river bones. Royal clerks referred to her as the late maid, when absolutely obliged to mention her at all. Chroniclers in Paris, eager for patronage, downplayed her battles and amplified the prowess of noble captains. One scribe even inserted a page-long digression on the architectural merits of the Troy ramparts, where Joan had, in fact, won surrender without lifting a sword. Stones endure, women's deeds crumble faster. Within a generation, soldiers who had knelt for her blessing were gray-haired men warning grandsons against the folly of listening to voices. Peasant families stitched her into winter tales, a ghost rider by moonlight who led lost children home. The church, watching reputations like candles too near a curtain, kept her file marked ambiguous. Her heresy conviction remained on the books, not loudly, but firmly enough to discourage pilgrimages. Meanwhile, France reorganized itself, bureaucracy widening like tree rings. New taxes required paperwork. Paperwork required literacy. Literacy required clerks to draft fresh myths. Joan's story, raw, unruly, didn't parse neatly. She was neither noble nor cleric, neither wife nor widow, and heaven speaking through a farm girl unsettled the tidy chain of hierarchy. Easier then to muffle the echo. Centuries turned. Wars came and went. Kings lost heads. Republics sprouted like weeds after summer rain. Each regime rummaged the past for symbols. Some found Joan too Catholic, others too monarchist, others simply too female for comfort. Her banner gathered dust in a Loire sacristy. The sword from the church floor changed hands twice, miscatalogued as Gallic relic, uncertain provenance. Then the 19th century arrived with printing presses that devoured forgotten stories like hungry wolves. Romantic writers hunting noble tragedies rediscovered trial transcripts moldering in Rouen. They read the Latin scribbles, her stubborn eloquence under interrogation, and smelled smoke curling off the pages. Poets polished her into a crystal of purity. Painters draped her in moonlit armor, eyes upturned, lips parted for angel breath. Nationalists followed. France, bruised by defeat in 1871, craved a hero unsullied by modern blunders. Joan re-emerged in pamphlets, now cast as the eternal daughter of the patrie, blade glittering against foreign invaders. The Church, seeing an opportunity to reclaim moral authority, reopened her case with papal vigor. Witnesses' grandchildren testified to miracles worked at the scaffold. Theologians weighed ashes against dogma and found sanctity where once they found sin. In 1909, Rome beatified her. In 1920, canonized her. Bishops swung censers under chandeliers, while politicians inked speeches. Joan served both altar and senate, a consecrated coin passed between pious fingers and patriotic palms. French schoolchildren recited her feats, though the smell of burning flesh never made the curriculum. A postage stamp carried her face, a battleship bore her name, merchants bottled Saint-Jean cologne, promising valor in every dab. Yet the rehabilitation was selective. The peasant who had sparred with theologians over linen and lace became, in textbooks, modest and obedient. The strategist who had browbeaten generals turned into a waif guided entirely by priests. Her fury thinned into piety, her shrewdness into simplicity. They canonized a version of her that would never have terrified a garrison. 2 world wars later, propaganda offices again borrowed her armor. Vichy banners and resistance graffiti both invoked her ghost, proving a martyr's silhouette fits any flag if the light is angled right. Each side claimed her last cry echoed their cause. Meanwhile, the real cry, half-choked, interrupted by flame, remained untranslated. What of the people who had followed her in life? Their descendants filed petitions for pensions that never came. Lahire's lineage dwindled into provincial anonymity. Etienne's family kept a fragment of charred banner under floorboards until moths reduced it to silken dust. Ordinary memory, unlike state myth, must find space between rent and harvest. And what of Joan herself, the sum of beatings, visions, cramps, and courage? She survives in contradictions, icon of monarchy and republic, of pacifist devotion and military ferocity, of chastity and subversive gender. Scholars count 3,000 books debating whether her voices were divine, epileptic, or cunning theatrics. None conclude. The stage lights remain lit, the actress long gone, the audience still arguing over the script. Erasure, thus, was never clean. It left impressions, like a pressed flower whose outline stains the paper even after the petals fall. France tried to bury her, then found the soil richer for her bones. Each era unearthed what it needed: saint, soldier, symbol, sister, never the whole woman who once cinched hose against menstruation, cursed at splinters, and laughed after climbing wall ladders slick with blood. Stand in Rouen market square today. Tourist plaques list measurements of the stake, Baroque reconstructions of the pyre. Beneath the paving stones, her ashes mingle with centuries of rain and spilled wine. Air still smells of crepes and diesel, but some claim, on humid afternoons, a faint tang of pitch and wool. Memory seeps even through cobblestones. 500 years on, statues of bronze and marble cannot contain her. She slips their grasp, mounts her horse again, rides out of textbooks into the uneasy dreams of anyone who believes justice eventually rewards its servants. For every crown placed on a king's head, for every flag raised over a war's corpse-littered mud, Joan lingers at the edge, asking with singed lips whether gratitude will outlive convenience this time. History rarely answers. It files fresh paperwork, drafts new myths, and looks away from the girl who once told it to ride forward. They were boys who still tripped on the hems of borrowed tunics, but war needed hands more than innocence. When the maid rode into a town, the grown men stared, the clergy fretted, and the boys simply followed, like sparks chasing tinder. Etienne had been the first, 15, spine all angles, eyes already carrying too many midnights. He became her page, quartermaster, confessor of trivial sins. After him came Pascal, 12 and fierce, who claimed he could outshoot crows at 50 paces. He could not, but courage isn't arithmetic. Then Henri, who had never left his village until he left it entirely behind in Joan's shadow, and Mark the miller's orphan, who whispered to horses better than to people. They drilled at dawn with sticks shaved to approximate pikes. Real steel was scarce, and no one dared arm them fully. Yet they learned the rhythm of formation, the snap of orders. Joan insisted they train alongside veterans, not behind them. Arrows find the youngest first, she told captains wary of casualties. The captains swallowed objections. No manual covered prophecy's chain of command. At Meung-sur-Loire, a boy named Benoit lied about his age. 12, he said, though his voice would not deepen for years. Joan caught him trying to knot a sword belt twice around his waist. She knelt, retied it once, snug. "When you're taller, show me," she said. Benoit stood straighter, as though height could be willed. The boys fetched water, sharpened stakes, carried messages through arrow drizzle. They also carried rumor. They whispered that Joan's banner glowed at night, that her prayers kept wolves from camps, that she once blessed a loaf and it fed 2 dozen. Tales fattened their thin ribs with daring. Not all grown soldiers approved. One evening La Hire grumbled that children belonged to mothers, not trenches. Joan answered, "Which mother is safer, one behind English lines, or the one who knows her son marches where angels ride flank?" Lair had no answer, so he taught them to curse in Breton instead. The boys suffered terrors scaled to their size. When Cannon first spoke outside Jargeau, Mark froze mid-stride, bladder giving way. A pikeman laughed until Joan dismounted, draped her cloak over the wet stain, and ordered the column forward as if nothing smelled of fear. Later, Mark cleaned her horse's hooves with trembling diligence, speaking only the apology his eyes carried. She answered with bread. Benoit took an arrow at Patai, through the calf, clean exit. He wept not from pain, but shame that the shaft hadn't found his chest like heroes in songs. Joan visited the field medic's tent, laid her palm above the bandage. "Better a living limp than a perfect corpse," she said. He nodded, tears drying into resolve. Yet some boys did meet song-worthy ends. Henri disappeared in the smoke at Paris, his cap found days later near the moat, arrowhole neat as quill work. Etienne folded the cloth into a pouch he wore thereafter, silent about the weight it added. Joan kept count in a ledger no steward saw. Each lost name pricked her nightly prayers. When saints praised victory, she sometimes reminded them of the price in boy years. Catherine answered with sorrow, Margaret with steel, Michael with the unsentimental truth that wars spend youth by the cartload. The boys loved her fiercely, not as icon, but as older sister who knew the jokes priests forbid. She once taught them a Domremy rhyme about cows too proud to give milk until flattered, an absurd lullaby shouted while pitching tents in sleet. Laughter carried across mud, unnerving English scouts who reported enemy morale disturbingly high. On the march to Reims, as banners rippled like sunrise, the boys led chants. Veterans joined, then townsfolk along the road. A procession formed, children's voices peeling the sky open, inviting a crown to descend. Joan rode at the center, but felt herself carried on their thin shoulders, the way a body rides a river. After her capture, confusion cleaved them. Pascal tried to ride after the retreating English column alone. Veterans dragged him back. Benoit hobbled without crutch to every sentry post, insisting the maid would return by dawn. Etienne wrote frantic petitions to commanders, rescue plans sketched with ink, blotched by tears he denied. Months later, when smoke over Rouen signaled the end, the boys felt it before word arrived. Mark collapsed mid-task, sensing a silence where her voice should have been. Soldiers let them mourn in corners, embarrassed by their own dry eyes. Peace, such as it was, scattered them. Some limped home, some enlisted under new banners that paid in coin instead of cause, some vanished along the roads that never lack for restless youth. History traced none of them beyond stray marriage records, and a few pension appeals stamped denied. But echoes linger. Etienne, grown gray, taught his grandchildren the Domremy cow rhyme. Pascal, according to parish lore, became a blacksmith who refused to shoe horses for occupying troops. Mark's niece told travelers he once shoed a marauding band by raising a ragged scrap of linen like a banner and shouting a name the raiders did not recognize, but still feared. In royal chronicles, their identities calcified into footnotes. Juvenile attendants, military pages, miscellaneous youth. Yet every dented helm locked away in attics carried a notch they'd polished. Every whispered bedtime prayer borrowed her cadence. Every village dance featured boys eager to prove bravery measured by deeds, not birthdays. If you stand in the fields where their small hands stacked earthworks, listen when wind scythes through rye. Some swear you'll hear high voices chanting lines older than courage, stitched together from rumor and rhyme. They sing of a girl who rode ahead, and of the boys who followed without being told they were too young to matter. And the wind answers with a sound like pennants, snapping. Thin cloth, perhaps, but strong enough to pull a nation forward. Start the clock at midnight, the hour when campfires have burned to red eyes, and even fear naps for a moment. You lie on straw that smells of mice and mildew. The night air knifes through gaps in the tent. Your armor is your blanket. 2 hours in, a sentry shakes you. False alarm, only wind. But you're awake now, pulse racing like hooves. That's hour 1, sleep denied by duty. Hour 2, prayer. Not the soft parchment kind, but the clenched jaw version whispered to saints who sometimes answer with silence. Knees bruise on frozen ground. You recite the litany anyway because tomorrow's plan, ladders, arrows, smoke, needs more than sinew. Hour 3. Lace the hose, bind the chest, cinch the belt. Metal bites skin it's sworn to protect. Boots, still damp from yesterday's ford, greet your toes with cold that feels personal. You wonder how Joan handled cramps under plate. Your imagination flinches. Hour 4. Breakfast is a grayish porridge, part oat, part mystery. You eat 3 spoonfuls before gagging. Joan would finish the bowl, then fast until night, calling it focus. Hour 5, drill. Shield up, spear out, lungs wheezing in armor that triples your weight. Sweat pools under linen, steam fogs your visor. Joan, 5 foot nothing, sparred till veterans begged pause. Hour 6, march. Mud yanks at boots, pack saw shoulders. A comrade mutters he'd sell his soul for a mule. Joan jokes that heaven haggles better and picks up her pace. Hour 7, arrival beneath enemy walls. Arrows hiss like angry wasps. One splits the air near your ear. You flinch hard enough to feel shame bloom. Joan would raise her banner so the whole battlement could measure its courage by hers. Hour 8, first climb. Ladder rungs slick with grease. Enemy trick. Your foot slips. Shin slams wood. Pain sparks tears. You descend shaking. Joan would haul herself up anyway, praying between clenched teeth and cursing splinters by name. Hour 9, retreat to regroup. A captain barks that cowards die twice. You study your trembling hands, realize you've died already. Joan would be mapping a second assault, charcoal scratching dirt, arrow lines, decoy fires, spared bakeries. Hour 10, Pike's charge. You thrust, miss, thrust again. The man opposite you, English, freckles, eyes young, bucks, then drops. Blood on your knuckles, stomach lurches. Joan told soldiers to see God in victory and humanity in the fallen. You see bile. Hour 11, wound dressing. A cut on your forearm stitched with catgut, no wine left for dulling. You scream. Joan took an arrow in the shoulder at Paris, pulled the shaft through, and insisted on rejoining the breach before the bandages dried. Hour 12. Councils argue strategy. You lean on a cart, legs pudding. Joan would be inside the tent standing straight, quoting saints while seasoned men listen as though thunder had opinions. Hour 13. Quick mass. The chaplain stumbles over Latin. You mumble, half asleep. Joan corrects the priest gently, finishes the psalm, then confesses in full because tomorrow is not promised, and clarity matters. Hour 14. Second climb. Smoke now obscures the wall. You cough yourself dizzy. Joan uses the cover, talks the last hesitant soldier onto the ladder, then leads from the rung above him. Hour 15. Breach. Melee chaos. Steel clanging prayers nobody wrote down. You swing wildly, helmet askew. Joan moves with deliberate economy. Parry, push, banner thrust like a spear of light. Enemies balk. Allies surge. Hour 16. Fort falls. Your legs collapse in ash. Joan walks the rampart, checks prisoners are spared, orders the fire doused near the grain store because bread feeds both victory and survivors. Hour 17. Scavenging supper. You devour hard bread so fast gums bleed. Joan gives her portion to a drummer boy missing half an ear, then drafts a letter of mercy to the next enemy garrison. Ink replaces blade. Terror travels faster than supply trains. Hour 18. Sunset inspection. Boots blister. Shoulders throb. You fail to salute. Joan dismounts to tighten a young archer's cuirass, notices your slump, tells you tomorrow will be harder. Said kindly, but still a summons. Hour 19. War council. Maps unfurl. Candles gutter. You drift near sleep on your feet. Joan debates sally routes with captains twice her age, wins by logic and the fact that no one wants to disappoint whatever voices drum behind her eyes. Hour 20. Fever crawl. The gash on your arm burns. You shiver, though air is warm. Joan, often feverish, would wrap horse blanket tight, bind her wounds with linen stripped from her own hem, and pen a quick prayer, thanking God for pain's reminder. Hour 21. Confession of doubt. You whisper to the dark that you miss home, and perhaps God has favorites, not including you. Joan knew that whisper, answered it aloud. Forward. Then answered it again at dawn. Hour 22. Rat scurry wakes you. You reach for dagger, fumble. Joan once joked she feared rodents more than swords, then set traps before sleeping anyway. Fear acknowledged, not obeyed. Hour 23. Trumpet alarm. A false start. You scramble, heartbeat an anvil. Joan would already be mounted, banner catching starlight, demanding clarity from guards too intimidated to stutter. Hour 24. Dawn again. Your joints creak, courage thin as gruel. Joan cinches her belt, thanks the saints, and rides toward the next wall. History insists cannot fall. 7 days of this, cycles of hunger, strategy, prayer, blood, and doubting silence. Could you carry a banner pole that bruises palms raw, laugh after arrow splinters lodges in wood inches from your throat, lead men older than your father, plead mercy for enemies, and still believe heaven bothers to listen? Could you bleed monthly inside armor while preaching purity to soldiers edging on despair? Could you face fire, literal fire, because a courtroom prefers dresses to hose? Most of us would snap by hour 10, perhaps 12 if pride runs deep. Joan lasted years, from muddy village lanes to coronation aisles to a pyre whose smoke stains the margins of every chronicle that tried to mute her. So next time doubt whispers you are small, recall how small she was, and how the world, reluctantly, violently, bent anyway. Then ask not what you could survive as Joan, but what shard of her stubborn horizon you might carry into your own impossible week. If this long night's journey through mud, miracles, and marrow sparked something in you, wonder, outrage, gratitude, don't leave it cooling in the ashes. Share this story with one friend who thinks history is a dusty shelf. Prove that it still bleeds and breathes. Comment below which moment hit hardest, her sleepless dawns, the boys who followed, or the dress that couldn't cage her. Your words keep the banner flying. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next plunge into the beautiful, brutal past. We'll keep lighting torches. You bring the matches. Because miracles may be rare, but listening and acting are choices we can make every single day.